Lydersen. Jamie is an associate specialist in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a contractor for the USDA Forest Service's Pacific Southwest Research Station. Jamie received a Master's of Science in Ecology from the University of California, Davis back in 2012, and her research focuses on fire ecology and forest restoration of the Sierra Nevada mixed conifer forests, with a special emphasis on science questions that can be applied on the ground for forest management. And so today she's focusing on the 2013 Rim Fire and the conditions that influence that fire severity. Give us a second here while we switch over to Jamie's screen and we'll let her take it away. Great, we can see your screen, Jamie. Go ahead. One second, I think, let me change a setting here. Okay, go ahead, try again.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and thank you to everyone for signing up today, signing on to hear me talk. Always good to have an audience. So as Stacy said, I'm going to be presenting a study that we recently did looking at the effect of fuels management, previous wildfire, and fire weather on rim fire severity. I'll first give an overview of the rim fire, just to talk about what was unique about that fire. I'll then focus on a study we did looking at the effect of fuels treatments on fire severity. We had three approaches for looking at that. We did a census of all pixels across the fire perimeter, an analysis of the proportion of high severity within sample landscapes to look at the influence of different factors on landscape level fire severity, and then also an analysis of how fire severity changes as the fire encounters a fuel treatment and progresses into it. And then I'll end with a summary talking about the implications of our findings and how that relates to other work. The rim fire occurred in the central Sierra Nevada in 2013. It's the largest fire to date to happen within the Sierra Nevada, over 250,000 acres burned. It started on Stanislaus National Forest and then burned into Yosemite National Park. And there's a wide range of elevation within the fire footprint, from 870 feet up to 7,900 feet. The fire burned predominantly conifer forest. 68% of the area burned was conifer. There was also a substantial hardwood component, around 16%, and 7.5% shrubland. The map on the left shows rim fire severity, and probably most of you are familiar with fire severity maps, but I want to just quickly go over what that means, what the ecological effect is in the different classes. So the fire severity, this is showing the relative difference normalized burn ratio, which is calculated using satellite imagery collected from the year of the fire, prior to the fire, and then the year after the fire, and it's looking at the change in photosynthetically active vegetation. And it's often, especially in the Sierra Nevada, divided into four relative classes of fire severity. The unchanged class has no change to the overstory trees, and the fire only affects vegetation in the understory. This class also includes unburned islands within the fire perimeter. The low severity class has very little change in basal area, and most of the mortality happens in small diameter trees and fire sensitive species, which for the rim fire is white fir, incense cedar, and Douglas fir. The moderate severity class has the greatest range in fire effects, typically ranging with 26 to 75% change in tree basal area, and this often represents a transition from surface fire to crown fire. And then the high severity class is associated with crown fire, and the majority of the tree basal area is killed within this class. For the rim fire, 9% burned unchanged, 25% burned at low severity, 33% burned with moderate severity, and 33% burned at high severity. And it's really that high amount of high severity that that's one of the things about the rim fire that makes it interesting to fire scientists and managers. If you compare it to the natural range of variation for conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada, historically fires would have burned with 5 to 10% of high severity fire. So that 33% is 3 to 6 times higher than that. Another thing about the rim fire is that it had a few days of rapid fire growth. So it burned over a fairly wide, long time interval from August 17th to October 23rd. But 47% of the fire area burned during 2 large spread events, the first one occurring during the 21st to 22nd of August, and then the second from August 25th to 26th. I made a quick animation just to show another visual of the fire growth. This is going to show on the right will be the date, the progression date moving forward, and then it'll show the fire severity filling in. So here's that first spread event, and then there's the second one, and then growth was a bit more moderate after that. I've worked on 3 publications using data from the rim fire. I just wanted to quickly summarize the differences between them and mention what I'll actually be focusing on today. So we had a paper that came out in Forest Ecology and Management in 2014 that used field data from 53 plots in areas that had previously burned at low to moderate severity. That was field data collected several years before the fire. In 2016, we had a paper come out in Fire Ecology, which used field data from 175 plots that were, the data was collected the year of the fire, sampling for a different project that got interrupted by the rim fire. And then we went back, this was through the Stevens Lab at Berkeley, they went back 1 year after the fire and resampled those so that we could look at the pre and post-fire forest structure and the fire effects within those plots. And then the recent study just came out this year in Ecological Applications, and this was a GIS-based analysis of the entire fire area to look at the effect of treatments in previous fire severity, or previous wildfire. So this last study is the one that I'll be focusing on today. I'll show just a couple slides with data from the 2016 paper, and then I'm not going to say much about the 2014 paper, but I will at the end just do a comparison of the results from the new paper to the old paper. Our overarching question for the 2017 study was whether or not fuels management can influence the extent of high severity fire. We had 3 approaches to answer this question. The first was to do a census of all pixels across the fire perimeter to compare the effect of different treatment types on fire severity. The second was an analysis of the proportion of high severity fire within sample landscapes. With that analysis, we wanted to answer how much of the landscape needs to be treated to see an effect on the amount of high severity fire on a landscape, and what other factors are important for predicting how much high severity fire you'll get. And then our third analysis was to look at how fire severity changes when the fire progresses or moves into a treated area. We wanted to know if fire severity was reduced within treated areas and at what distance that effect became apparent. For these analyses, we're mostly interested for this study in looking at the high severity fire. And the reason is just because of the large degree of ecological change that happens within these high severity patches. On average, they have 94% change in basal area and a 99% change in tree density. So it is a stand replacing event that changes from a forest of overstory trees to no living trees. And this also happened for the rim fire over 33% of the fire area, which comes out to 74,000 acres. So it is a big change across this landscape, and a big management question of what's going to happen to those acres. And again, just to compare to the natural range of variation, it was a much higher proportion of high severity in the rim fire than natural or historical fires. And one concern with these high severity patches is that studies have shown that there is often very low natural conifer regeneration happening after wildfire. A study by Brandon Collins and then a more recent one by Kevin Welch found this. I also wanted to point out that the spatial configuration of high severity patches is very important. If you have all your high severity in one big patch, it's going to make a big difference for regeneration as well as wildlife use patterns compared to if you have your high severity more spread around with in smaller patches with closer distance to surviving canopy trees. And this study doesn't focus at all on the spatial configuration, but I just wanted to acknowledge its importance. This is again just emphasizing the amount of change in the forest structure that's occurring in the high severity class. This is showing data from the 2016 paper using 175 plots that were measured pre and post fire. And the only thing I really wanted to point out is, again, for this high severity class, the median mortality here is 100%. So it is stand replacing. Another thing about the rim fire that made it interesting to study was that it had a pretty rich history of previous fire severity, previous wildfire and previous fuel treatments. For our analysis, we included treatment history going back as far as 1995. And we separated the previous treatments in wildfire into several classes in order to look at the difference. For the wildfires, we looked at the effect of the fire severity of the previous fire. Around 4% of the study area had previously burned with unchanged fire severity. 14% had previously burned at low severity. 13% had previously burned at moderate severity, and around 6% had previously burned at high severity. There was also a significant amount of prescribed fire that had happened on the landscape before the rim fire, around 5%. We also included small wildfires in this category. Those are smaller than 100 acres, and they're small enough that they don't have a processed fire severity map. So I threw them in with the prescription fire, but it's actually a very small proportion of the area. So the majority of that prescribed fire class was intentional prescribed fire. For the mechanical treatments, we had a small amount of the area that had received surface treatment only. That included yarding and pile burning, as well as chipping. And then around 6% of the area had been thinned prior to the rim fire. That included commercial and pre-commercial thinning, and it also included areas that had had both thinning and surface treatments, manual surface treatments, such as pile burning. And then a very small area had had thinning combined with prescribed fire, only 0.2%. But we wanted to keep that category separate because it's of a lot of interest to managers. And also previous reviews have shown that thinning combined with prescribed fire is a lot more effective than either one alone. And then around half of the area had not burned or seen a previous treatment prior to 1995, or I'm sorry, since 1995, prior to the rim fire. This shows the results of our census of rim fire severity by treatment class. The different colors within each bar are the fire severity observed in the rim fire. So the first 4 bars on the left are the previous wildfire severity, and we saw an increase in fire severity in the rim fire with increasing fire severity in the previous fire. And this previous high severity class had the greatest amount of high severity fire in the rim fire overall, with 49% reburning at high severity. And that's even higher compared to this class over here on the far right, areas that had previously not had any fuels treatment or fire prior to the rim fire. They burned with the second highest amount of high severity in the rim fire, with 38%. The lowest amount of high severity fire was observed in the thin and prescribed burn class with only 1%, and then the prescribed burn only class also had a low amount of high severity fire with only 12%. The mechanical treatments, surface and thinning, had a more intermediate amount of high severity fire. To quickly summarize that again, the previous high severity had the greatest proportion of high severity fire in the rim fire. Previously untreated or unburned areas also had a large amount of high severity fire. Prescription fires, particularly when combined with thinning, had the lowest proportion of high severity, and the mechanical thinning and surface fuels treatment were intermediate in the amount of high severity. And I also want to point out that there was some high severity observed in all of these treatment types. None of them completely eliminated it. And I'll get back to that at the end of the talk. Our next analysis looked at what factors influence fire severity within sample landscapes. To answer this question, we made sample windows to represent sample landscapes across the fire perimeter. This was all done in GIS. There was no field sampling. We looked at 3 different scales of landscape sample: 500 acre, 2,500 acre, and 5,000 acre samples. Our response variable of interest was proportion high severity in each sample. And we used random forest analysis to look at the influence of a number of variables on the proportion of high severity fire in each of these sample landscapes. The first variable we included was proportion of the landscape treated. And we included low to moderate severity wildfire in here as a fuel treatment, even though it wasn't intentional, but we didn't include high severity fire. We also looked at 2 weather variables, the burning index and the energy release component. Burning index is related to the expected flame length, and energy release component is related to fuel moisture. So the burning index varies a lot day to day based on wind speeds, while the energy release component is a bit more stable and based more on the humidity. We included 2 water balance variables, actual evapotranspiration and climatic water deficit. AT is related to site productivity, and deficit is related to water stress. And then we also included vegetation variables, which were the proportion of the landscape in each of the most common vegetation types found within the fire. And that was based on the 2012 land fire existing vegetation layer. Here are the results of the random forest analysis, looking at the ranking of which variables had the most impact on the proportion high severity fire in the rim fire. The 3 graphs are the 3 different landscape scales that we assessed. And then the variables are listed in the order from having the greatest effect down to having the least effect. And the dots just show the relative difference between those of which had the most effect. Oops, sorry. So the same 3 variables were ranked as the most important at all 3 scales. And that included the 2 weather variables, the burning index and the energy release component, and the proportion of the area treated. These are partial dependence plots for the smallest scale of the analysis, 500 acre landscape samples. The partial dependence plots are just for those 3 variables that were identified as having the greatest effect on proportion fire severity. And these show what the nature of the relationship is between each of these variables and the amount of high severity fire. So with the burning index and the energy release component, you see what you'd expect, where there's a positive relationship. Higher values of BI and ERC are more conducive to burning. And we did see a greater proportion of high severity fire. For the burning index, when values were greater than around 80, there was a much greater increase in the amount of high severity fire. And the energy release component, you tended to see more high severity fire when values were above 73. For proportion treated at the 500 acre scale, a fairly large amount of that landscape had to be treated before there was an effect. So between 50 and 75% of the landscape had to be treated to have an effect on fire severity. And after about 75% treated, there were not further reductions seen in the amount of high severity fire in the sample landscapes. We had similar results at 2,500 acres, again with the burning index getting more high severity fire when that was over 80, and the energy release component increasing after the amount of high severity fire after around 73. Proportion treated still had a negative effect, as you'd expect with the amount of high severity fire, but a smaller amount was required on the larger landscape to see an effect. Between 25 and 60% of the area treated showed decreases in the amount of high severity fire, and after about 60% treated, there wasn't much additional benefit to doing more treatment. At 5,000 acres, it's again similar for the burning index and energy release component, and the percent treated, it's an even lower amount of these larger landscapes that needed to be treated, with between 10 and 40% showing decreases over that range, and after about 40%, not as much benefit to doing additional treatments. To summarize that analysis, the burning index, energy release component, and percent treated were the most important variables at all spatial scales of analysis for influencing the amount of high severity fire. The burning index had the greatest influence at the two smallest scales, while the percent treated had the greatest influence at the largest scale. And we saw that with increasing scale or greater size landscapes, at smaller scales, a greater proportion treated was needed to influence fire severity. So for the smallest sample size at 500 acres, 50 to 75% needed to be treated to see an effect on fire severity. And then 25 to 60% needed to be treated at 2,500 acres, and only 10 to 40% needed to be treated to see an effect on fire severity at the 5,000 acre size. Our third analysis was to look at how fire severity was affected when the fire burned into a treated area. To look at this, we generated GIS transects that were aligned with the general direction of fire spread. We then compared the fire severity outside the treatment to points along the transect inside the treatment at increasing distances from the treatment boundary. We included a comparison of treated transects that crossed into a treatment, as well as controlled or untreated transects that didn't cross into a treatment. Again, similar to the landscape analysis, we included low to moderate severity fire as a treatment, but not high severity fire, not previous high severity fire. And then we analyzed the incoming fire severity separately so that we could look at whether or not there were differences when high severity encountered a treatment versus when the fire was burning at moderate severity and it encountered a treatment versus if it was burning at low severity. This figure just shows an overview of those methods just to get a better picture of it. On the left is the progression map for the fire, and the fire origin point is down here in the southwest. So those transect points they radiate outwards from that point. And then on the right, just a subsection of the fire is zoomed in to show the difference between the controlled transects and the treated transects. The control ones are these red ones that don't cross into a treatment. The hash blue area is the treated areas. And then the treatment transects cross into the boundaries. Zooming in even further to look at two individual transects. The top one is a treatment transect. So what our analysis actually compared is the raw severity value averaged for these 5 points outside the treatment to the severity value for each point moving further into the treatment from the treatment boundary. And then the control transect, it was a similar idea where we averaged the values for the first half of the transect and then looked at increasing distances along the second half of the transect, how the fire severity compared to that first half. And we found that when the fire burned into treated areas, it was reduced in fire severity. The top two set of lines is when fire was burning at high severity, and the dashed lines are the control treatments, or excuse me, the control transects. So if the fire was burning at high severity and didn't encounter a treatment, it tended to stay at high severity, whereas this treated transect line here, when the fire was burning at high severity and encountered a treatment, the severity was immediately reduced and stayed lower. These asterisks represent statistical significance with respect to the first point along each line. Similarly, for moderate severity, for the control transects, if the fire was burning at moderate and didn't encounter any treatment, it tended to stay moderate. Whereas if it encountered a treatment by about 50 to 100 meters, it was significantly lower and stayed lower within the treatment. We saw a slightly different pattern with low severity fire. When the fire was burning at low severity and hit a treatment, it actually increased slightly over time, but it increased less for this line, for the solid line with the treatment transects had a lower increase than the control. And also, it stayed low. So for the fire severity classes, the threshold between low and moderate severity fire is around 316. So in both cases, especially for the treated transects, it's well within that range. To summarize, high and moderate severity fire were significantly reduced when they encountered and burned into a fuels treated area. High severity fire transitioned to moderate severity, and moderate severity transitioned to low to moderate. And low severity stayed low within treatments, although it did increase slightly. I'll go into the final conclusions now. We found that fire weather was very important in predicting the amount of high severity fire. This isn't surprising. So the burning index and energy release component reflect weather generally more conducive to burning. It represents lower fuel moisture and greater expected flame lengths. But I also wanted to point out that during the 2 days of, or the 4 days, the two spread events of when the fire really grew in size, it was also burning under plume-dominated conditions. And so when a fire has a plume-dominated situation shows that the fire is burning with higher intensity, and that actually can create local weather conditions at the flaming front that are different than the overall ambient conditions that you would pick up at a weather station. And this is just caused by, as the plume is rising, it's pulling air in, and the faster the plume rises, the more, and the bigger it is, the more air it's going to pull in, which will increase the surface wind speed at the flaming front, which will then lead to more extreme fire behavior. And the formation of a fire plume is influenced by both weather and fuels. So the drier conditions will help it get started, but you also need enough to burn. And then also unstable air masses also help contribute to plume formation. To compare our results to a couple of other studies that have been done of the fire, Harris and Taylor did a good paper in 2015, and so did Kane et al. In 2015. Both of those studies found little to no effect of fire weather on fire severity, but they both were done on subset areas of the fire that were outside of the days burning on plume-dominated fire days. So that implies that that more extreme burning, once it happens, does have a bigger effect than you'd expect from just weather alone on the amount of high severity fire. We also found that fuels treatments had a very strong effect on the amount of high severity fire. Fuels treatments were effective at lowering fire severity relative to untreated areas. We saw this both with the lower proportion of high severity fire observed in sample landscapes and also in the analysis of fire progression moving into treatments, where the fire severity was reduced within the first 50 to 100 meters of encountering a fuel treatment. We saw that prescribed fire was more effective, especially when combined with thinning compared to other treatment types. But this may be not just due to the actual treatment type, but there can also be pre-existing differences in the forest structure for what treatments are applied where. So the prescribed fires were generally, most of the time, conducted on the national park side of the fire, which would have had much less historical logging and a greater remaining density of large trees that would also be expected to burn with be less susceptible to high severity fire. And in addition, there can be differences in topography for what treatment gets applied where. A really steep slope may be less likely to receive a treatment, especially something like thinning. It may be just unavailable for doing that type of manual treatment. And the topography can also influence the fire behavior and fire severity. We found that previous high severity fire was associated with reburning at high severity in the rimfire. And this is a concern because it can reflect that these areas are at a definite risk for permanent type conversion to non-forest. Even if you get regeneration on those areas, if they reburn before the trees are able to be large enough to resist a fire, then they're going to just keep getting knocked back, and it'll be a non-forest vegetation type that's able to survive there. And we did observe some high severity fire within all the treatment types. So the fact that we saw some high severity in all treatment types implies that under the high to extreme burning conditions that we saw in the rimfire, fuels treatments do reduce but likely cannot completely eliminate high severity fire effects. Patches of high severity that occur within fuel treatments can happen for several reasons. One is if you're near the treatment boundary as the fire encounters it, if it remains high for a distance prior to decreasing. Another reason would be if there's a small spatial scale of the treatments relative to the incoming fire behavior. A smaller treatment is more likely to be overwhelmed by a more intense fire. And another reason is that older treatments may be less effective due to subsequent buildup of fuels. And this has been shown particularly for studies looking at areas that previously burned and then reburned in a subsequent fire. Older fires can both limit the spread of a fire into them, and then when burned areas reburn, they also, if it's an older previous fire, they tend to have more high severity fire than a younger fire would have when it reburns. And then finally, high severity can occur within treated areas due to local feedbacks between fire weather, topography, and fuels. Our analysis found no effect of vegetation on fire severity, but this could be due to the coarse nature of the vegetation variables we included. We looked at proportion in different rough classes, like conifer versus hardwood, but we didn't look at the vegetation structure within classes. This slide shows a figure from the 2016 paper using the plots that were measured immediately prior to the fire and then 1 year after. And the basal area is on the top and density is on the bottom, and pre-fire structure on the left, post on the bottom, and then the letters correspond to the different fire severity classes: unchanged, low, moderate, and high. And so in the post-fire, you definitely see what you'd expect, where you get this decrease in the amount of live trees following fire. And usually when I show this graph, people think it's kind of boring because you see what you'd expect where, yeah, high severity, everything's dead. But what I think is interesting about it, and what I wanted to show today, is this pre-fire forest structure, particularly with the density over here. These plots that ended up burning at high severity have about twice the density before the fire as the plots that burned at lower severity. And especially that's happening in these small tree size classes under 30.5 centimeters, which is about 12 inches. So what this implies is that if you want to prevent this situation where you have hardly any live trees, you need to get in ahead of the fire and deal with this small tree situation here. We didn't see a big effect of our water balance variables, but there was a marginal effect of actual evapotranspiration at the two larger scales of analysis. I just wanted to show this to compare to a previous study done by Kane et al. On the rim fire. They found a positive relationship between AET and rim fire severity and attributed it to more productive areas having a greater buildup of fuels that was then available for burning in the dry conditions of the rim fire. We also saw an effective scale in our analysis. Smaller landscapes needed a larger proportion treated in order to see an influence on the amount of high severity fire. So this implies that it's important to treat areas of high value if you want to prevent high severity fire happening in them. We did see, though, that after around 75% treated, there wasn't much additional benefit. So this implies that to really protect them, you also need to think about what's in the landscape surrounding them and treat outside of your area of interest as well. I'll finish by comparing to the 2014 paper. The 2014 paper used plot data from areas with relatively restored fire regime, and we define that as forested places that had burned at least twice in the last 30 years with low to moderate severity. And the idea is that since they had a restored fire regime, you'd expect them to be more resistant to wildfire, and when they reburn, the expectation would be that they would reburn at low severity. We did with that study find that plume-dominated fire and a higher burning index was associated with some of those plots reburning at moderate to high severity. We also found that the time since fire was strongly associated with the fire severity in the rim fire. Plots that it had been longer than 14 years since the prior fire were more likely to burn at high severity. But an important point for that for that study is that we didn't include a comparison to baseline or unburned forest. It was just comparing within previously burned areas. And I've seen that paper cited as saying that fuels treatments have no effect on fire severity. And I don't think that paper shows that. We did see more moderate and high severity than we would have expected, but we saw a strong effective time since fire, implying that previous fire does have an effect. It just wears out with time. And again, with no comparison to baseline, you can't really say that those previous fires had no effect, since you don't know what it would have been like if they hadn't been there at all. For the 2017 paper, we included the entire core of the fire area, so we were able to compare previously burned areas and treated areas to areas that had not seen fire or previous treatment. And we found that areas with no previous fire or fuels treatment, as well as areas that had previously burned at high severity, had the greatest amount of high severity fire in the rim fire. Similar to the 2014 paper, we found a strong association of greater fire weather associated with the greater amount of high severity fire. And we did find that fuels treatments and previous low to moderate severity fire can reduce fire severity. Some additional questions that we didn't look at with this analysis that would be good areas for future work would be whether or not a strategic placement of fuels treatments on a landscape can have an effect. If you could actually treat a smaller proportion of the landscape if you plan where to put those treatments. We also would have liked to look at whether or not fire severity was reduced on the lee side of a treatment. So when a fire is burning at a certain severity, encounters a fuel treatment, and then exits on the other side, is it lower on the far side than on the side when it got in? We couldn't do that just because of the coarse nature of the progression data. It was we couldn't accurately know the actual spread of the fire through a treatment. And then we also didn't look at treatment age with this study. And it would be really interesting to know if different treatments have, if some have an effect that lasts for longer in terms of reducing subsequent fire severity. So I'd like to acknowledge a bunch of people. Brandon Collins I worked with him on all of these papers. He's my supervisor. Our co-authors on the 2017 paper were Matt Brooks and J.R. Matchett at USGS and Kristen Shive at Yosemite National Park, Nick Povak, also with Pacific Southwest Research Station, and Van Kane at the University of Washington, and Gus Smith, formerly of Yosemite and now with the Forest Service. We received funding from the Joint Fire Science Program and consulted on statistical matters with Jim Baldwin at the Forest Service. And Becky Estes and Marty Gamelin helped us with compilation of fuels treatment on the Stanislaus side, and Kent Van Wagten-Donk helped us with compiling previous fire and fuel treatment on the National Park side. And with that, thanks for your time, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Jamie. I just wanted to mention too that I did say it at first, but I'll reiterate it. So if you registered, which means if you're in this room with us right now, you will be receiving a follow-up email that will include the recording of this, the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll also link to some of those papers that she referred to during the presentation so you can read further if you so desire. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with a question. This one is really easy. So Jamie, that first photo you had, was that a high intensity surface fire or a crown fire?
The first what?
The first photo, I think it was your intro photo.
Oh, it was neither, actually. It was, that was a photo taken in Aspen Valley in around 2009 prior to the rim fire. So that area did burn in the rim fire, but it was an area burned with a prescribed fire. I think last burned in the late 90s prior to the rim fire.
Okay, that's, like I said, that's starting off easy. Feel free to follow up with that if you have any further questions. The next one is, are these results for public lands only? Were there any private or industrial lands included? Didn't really look like it. Maybe there was no clear cuts involved.
Yeah, so we did include, for the landscape analysis and the census, we did include private lands. We used, for the fire severity map, we used the 1 year, this isn't, I don't know, hopefully this isn't too much technical detail, but we used the 1 year post-fire across all public lands, and for the private lands, so that we wouldn't be picking up fire severity, what we thought would be fire severity that was actually logging and management happening within the first year of fire. We used the immediate fire severity assessment, which is collected the same summer as the fire for those private lands. And that was one reason also that we used classified fire severity for those two analyses. For the analysis with the transects looking at the fire progression in the treatments, because we were using the raw RDNBR values, we just used only public lands for that analysis.
Okay, thanks for that answer. And I have to go back to the first one, actually. I think we're referring to the second photo that you had in your sequence there.
Same thing, actually. I think both those photos were from Aspen Valley.
Okay, great, thank you.
I don't take enough photos when I'm out, so I'm kind of limited. I figured it was related because they ended up burning later.
Yeah. And how many weather stations went into the BI and ERC calculations?
That's a good question, and we just used one. We only used the Crane Flat weather station. So even though there's a pretty big elevational range in the fire, most of the lower elevation is within the Tuolumne Canyon. And we did think about using different stations, but it would then be a bit more nuanced to decide which station you use where, because would it be based on similar elevation or just the closest one? So we ended up going with Crane Flat. So yeah, our weather variables, the burning index and the ERC, are pretty rough, broad, regional weather type measurements for looking at such a large fire footprint.
And is that something for future, you had your list there at the end of additional considerations, something maybe you'd recommend in the future, or do you think it did a fairly good representation?
I hope it did a good representation. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure having more detailed weather would definitely give a more accurate look at what the effect of the weather was on a specific location.
Sure, we scientists always love more information if we can process it. All right, we'll move back to the one about clear cuts. So were any of the areas you sampled, were they clear cuts? It didn't look like there was any of those listed in your legend of treatments.
Prior to the rim fire, I guess we don't have a good sense of the previous treatment history on private lands. That's a good point. But no, none of the treatments that we knew of that were included were clear cuts. They were mostly, yeah, they were thinning. And a lot of the time the thinning would have been in like an older plantation.
All right, and this one is a bit long here, so I'm going to assign it. Let me make sure that you can see it. I'll read it aloud to everybody too, but 1 second here. So can you see that now, Jamie?
Oh, let me expand the control panel. Is that how you do it?
Mm-hmm. And I'll go ahead and read it for everybody. Interesting results and conclusions. Reducing treatment history to a binary yes or no kind of misses the complexities. You mentioned some future questions. Important to know now times since treatment effect on canopy cover, other vegetation responses, and the influence of topography, soils, and climate on the vegetation and field recovery, and how this all influences fire severity. So with that, any thoughts?
Sorry, I'm not seeing. Where would I see the question? Okay, I can see like the last line of it, but it's really small. How would I make that section bigger?
So at the top, in the top right, there's a little expand arrow. There's a box with an arrow pointing out of it. And this is the second to last question down there.
I'm not getting it to show up.
That's all right. Why don't I just kind of summarize it for you? So, reducing treatment history to a binary yes or no misses the complexities. So talking about future questions, how it's important to know time since treatment effect on canopy cover, other vegetation response, and the influence of topography, soils, climate, just all these different factors, and how they influence fire severity. So I guess kind of thoughts about where to go with this. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be nice. It's true. So we did, for the landscape analysis especially, we had to combine all the treatments. I had thought about trying to keep them separate, but then you ended up with weird, if you had a landscape sample that had multiple treatment types, you were assigning it to like a maximum and then deciding, what percent area we would count as assigning it to a class, if that makes any sense. The only way I could really think to look at including all those details would be more of a pixel-based analysis, which People certainly do a lot for looking at the effects of repeat fire. I'm not sure how you would do it to look at a landscape question like we had. And again, it was the same situation with topography. It's harder to, get like a average value for topography, especially at that larger 5,000 acre scale. You're going to have a greater range of conditions in there. So yeah, other than I don't know how many thoughts I have. It would be nice, I agree, to have more detail on that. Since we wanted to take a landscape approach, we were limited in the amount of detail we could include. But yeah, probably with a pixel-based analysis, which is how we looked at the differences between treatment types, you could probably get at some of those questions.
Do you know, is there any research out there or any group of people who's kind of doing that more small-scale analysis of this fire or other fires?
I don't know, but there might be. And we did make the data for this paper publicly available through the Forest Service Data Archive. So our treatment map is actually available online through them. So at least the classes that we used could be included if someone wanted to work on that.
I always love hearing collaboration. All right, let's move on to the next question. And I'm not sure if you know this, this might be more of historical than what you guys looked at, but what were the objectives of the previous treatments in these areas? Were there any structures to protect, or was it primarily to protect standing forest values and commercial harvests?
I don't know. I think it varied depending on the treatment, and I don't have that level of detail on them. I would also guess it varies by agency somewhat. That kind of gets at the point that different treatments could have different pre-existing forest conditions, like on the national park side, a greater number of large trees that they were trying to protect with prescribed fire. But I don't really know enough about I know the agencies are, I think, limited in what treatments they can do in both cases, and how they prioritize where they do either prescribed burning or thinning. I don't know. Did I answer the whole question? Was there more? Sorry.
No, it's a pretty complex land management system out there, so I'm sure it depends is a good answer. So I think this is from a follow-up from an earlier question. Some have found that ground composite burn index, DBI, didn't correlate well with DNBR. Did you adjust the severity classes using CBI or other plot burn indices, or use the original DNBR products in your analysis? And if I need to define some acronyms, let me know, or maybe you know what those are.
I think I got it. So we used RDNBR instead of DNBR, which for the Sierra Nevada has been shown to correlate well with CBI. And we used the thresholds for the fire severity classes. We used thresholds from Miller and Sode, 2007, I think, where they looked at the correlation between CBI and RDNBR. And then that has been several papers since, also with Jay Miller, have looked at the fire, how well the forest structure is reflecting the changes within those classes. And in fact, the 2016 paper that I mentioned does that as well. We had data from the rim fire looking at the pre and post fire structure, and those classes separated pretty well in terms of how much mortality was observed within each class.
So we do have a few questions, and I'm not sure we're going to get to them all. So if we don't get to your question today, I will include, with Jamie, her contact information, and you can follow up with her after the webinar directly. Is that all right with you, Jamie?
Yep, sure.
All right. Let's try to go for one more before the end of the hour. Why does the scale of analysis matter relative to the effect of proportion of landscape treated?
So it could reflect that treatments need to be of a certain size. So for the smallest landscape size, a greater proportion needed to be treated. So if less is treated, then it could just be a smaller treatment getting overwhelmed by the fire. I don't know that I have a good answer beyond that. I think it's also just that there's more stochasticity really with those small treatments, and that there could be other factors beyond the treatment history that contributed to the fire severity that you'd see more across like the whole area, whereas when you're looking at a larger area, there's just more going on that can influence what happens within specific areas. And then, yeah, again, just the size of the sample landscape relative to the size of the treatment.
All right. I see that it is now officially 1 o'clock. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for our webinar today. I'll put one last plug in for that evaluation. It takes less than 5 minutes, helps us know how we're doing, and lets our funders know how we're doing, which is always important. And of course, thank you so much, Jamie, for your continued work, commitment to getting science out that can be used, and for your webinar today. It was a pleasure.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, and thanks. And if anyone had questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to send them to me.
All right, wonderful. Will do. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks.